Namaste and good evening, everyone. Today we continue part 5 on the exploration of Sanskrit language. Namaste, Sraddhalu, and
Namaste
welcome.
and welcome to all of you.
You may post your questions during the conversation in the chat box on YouTube, or you may send your questions beforehand at our email ID integralstudies.in@gmail.com. We had received a few comments, and I'm going to read the first one from Apurva. This episode was simply remarkable. For someone who has a whitewashed education, it was difficult to conceive the beauty of Sanskrit experientially. What was fascinating was around 90 minutes of the last episode, I was becoming calm naturally and could sense thoughts as energies. The experience was concrete, and boom, you started talking about how different worlds are not far by distance, but by phenomena. The intuition that Sanskrit language opens up is simply mind-blowing. Thank you for this series. Please keep doing what you're doing. And then we received one more comment from Nikhil. In my view, Deva Bhasha is essentially a matter of the one original language of mankind, of which Sri Aurobindo speaks in the book The Hymns to the Mystic Fire. I am of view further that such original language belongs to the spaceless self, the self which Sri Aurobindo reveals in Savitri, page 724. Am I correct to think so? And a last question from First Law. Why is Gayatri mantra considered as the mother mantra of the Veda?
Okay. So we have three questions, one comment and two questions, but I want to merge them all into one larger discussion while addressing the questions and comments themselves, but also take it further into the implications. First of all, for Purva's observations about this underlying sense of intuition which is implicit to the Sanskrit language. The problem we have as primarily English speaking, and I will use the word English thinking people, or whatever other languages may be which are not close enough to the original Deva Bhasha. The problem is that we are used to thinking of language as a thing in itself. We think of language as something which is created for purpose of communication by us. So we decide to name objects, and then we communicate with others by using those names. Now this description, you will see, is typical of the reasoning mind and the sense mind, where the mind, let's say, which is inside us, depending on how you want to see it, is universal or it's inside us, does not in itself know a thing. I see horse as an object, I see mountain as an object, and then I create a representation of it in the mind. So I have a word, I say horse or ashwa, mountain, and I use the word mountain. But in my mind, there is the idea of an object which is not the object, and then there is a name given which is an arbitrary sound. Or at least that's the way the modern degenerate languages are formed. And so our idea of language itself is this very artificial construct. And we stop with that because that's all we have known, that's all we have been taught. What happens when you start learning Sanskrit, or even when you learn one of the derived languages which still recalls the sense of root sounds, where the language itself tells you, by the way, there are roots, go back to the root to understand the word. And if you're taught this from childhood, you do not conceive of language as something arbitrary. You do not see the experience as a primary mental experience, as this corresponds to this arbitrarily in my mind, and now I better align to your associations and you better align to my associations. Rather, the concept of root sounds, and this happens to children as they dwell in Sanskrit, begins with there is already an implicit quality, sound, vibration, which then I am articulating to point to that thing. So somehow the idea of language is something which is a natural, self-existent reality that we tune into and by which we communicate naturally because it is the same natural truth, self-existent language that is present in all. So this makes a fundamental shift. This is one of the points which I will highlight as we go along, that when we actually change our way, our language, let's say, it changes the mind's assumptions. This is an assumption, oh, this is an arbitrary construct with associations. No, here the assumption is it already exists and we are only trying to glimpse and give form to it. That mind assumption, it's like an underlying worldview, perspective, which affects the thought processes which are a consequence of this perspective, which then changes how your thought processes operate because of this implicit shift, paradigm. As a result, you also have a change in your attitudes to life. Now, I've said this in a very general way right now, and as we proceed, I would like to give some examples and elaborate. So this is going to be one important aspect. The other thing which also I'm drawing on Apurva's observation, this intuitive character, that if once you recognize there is something already above and you have to tune into, you are constantly making an effort to tap into something higher. And as a result, with no other special effort, your mind is being turned upward to a conception that there is an intuitive knowledge. And all we are expressing is coming from that. Now this is so important because when you go to the Upanishadic texts, the Vedic texts, or generally any of the more ancient sacred texts, there is this idea already that the knowledge is there. And we are only glimpsing it or giving form to it. Or as the Vedic rishis declare that the knowledge itself is one and the wise men see it differently or see aspects of it or give form to it in different ways. And this now becomes so natural, so obvious. Out of that, when a whole, let's say, religious culture develops, because every civilization has to pass through its religious phases where it is glimpsing things behind the scenes, behind appearances, and trying to make a link between the superficial appearance and the deeper sense behind, which is still crude perhaps. And that's what gives form to the early forms of religions. Still implicit to the religion is this idea that there is already an underlying truth and the religion is only trying to link, to articulate, to form a bridge between the inner or higher worlds and the surface or lower worlds. Which again is radically different from the form of religion as it exists in the European or Abrahamic context, where we are taught even today that the word religion, coming from the root of religare, to link, to combine or draw connections, and it's taught today even in European schools, it is to form the group of the religion. If you go slightly deeper, maybe in the religious tradition itself, or at least in the mystical content of the religious tradition, you will be reminded it is to link yourself to God, to the higher truth. But that knowledge has already receded, and what is taught today in universities is just a groupism. And therefore, inherent to that idea of religion is one group against another. In the Indian context, where this idea of an underlying truth already self-existent and universal and eternal, that we are aligning to, even as the religions form, implicit is the idea that each one has his own way of forming, articulating, or practicing, or relating to that inner or higher reality. There is no groupism. There is an extreme even of individualism to the extent that each one is free uniquely to follow their own unique line of relation with the divine, and yet you can have groups of similarities, of affinities, of alignments, of similar needs or forms and so on, which is what makes for the religious groups or subgroups. And so it is almost natural that you would have groups and subgroups always in all the Indian religions. And there's no problem with that. Nobody sees this as a division. They see it as a particularization of specific needs. And the divisions happen only when you forget that there is the same one truth, that we are only approaching differently according to our nature, our needs, our current evolutionary stage. And therefore in India you find there is no conflict between religions fundamentally. The conflicts may be economic, political, for other reasons. They may use religions, but they are not religious conflicts, which is also why it can embrace and accept all kinds of practices, traditions, even the Abrahamic religions without a problem, until they start dominating or cutting you and breaking you up in order to control, etc. So what you see is, even in the tendency of the religious mind, the link to the unity is not lost, and therefore there is an inherent universality. Now I'm showing all this in some detail because you see all this boils down to the implicit paradigm of the language itself, or the worldview which is behind the language. And so I'm linking this not only to the opening to the intuition, but also to its practical implications. And I link this now to Nikhil's comment that the one original language of mankind, he says, is it belongs to the spaceless self. And am I correct to think so? Yes, in a way. Only I would not particularize it to spaceless self. I would say to the self generally. Because the self includes its transcendence, its immanence, its individualization, all at the same time. So again, this becomes natural to the mind that is so aligned in this paradigm, that one which is transcending finds its own words, vocabularies, forms, etc. And so you have this continuum built up, but it's always the self. So in the Vedic text, and we read a portion last time from Kapala Shastriyar's observation, where he referred to a particular quotation that is translated as the bull, and the bull vrish in the Sanskrit, in the Vedic Sanskrit. When you look at Sri Aurobindo's translation of this root vrish, and I'm looking at a text now from the volume which is called Vedic and Philological Studies, and he's studying Mandala 4, and he's going to the root sounds to explain the deeper sense of the mantras. So vrish, he describes in 4 nuances or aspects of the meaning. One is to go, approach, flow, glide, movement. 2, to push, movement, pressure, force implicit. 3, because the force intensified, to kill, injure, pierce. So in the modern vocabulary, the reason why we call it bull, actually it's not bull, it's vrish, which is the name used for bull as vrishabha, because the bull is goring. You see, the cow we saw is this plenitude that she gives, but the bull is this force and the sharp horns by which it goes to protect, to defend, to attack, etc. So therefore that becomes vrishabha. Also there is a sense, the male, masculine principle. But I'm going ahead of myself. And 4th, to shine. Now when you see the root rish, and from there you look at variations. Rishi, sage, ray of light, luminous. Rishu, great, strong, powerful. Rishya, white-footed antelope. Interesting. So you see here already the sense of force, swiftness, rapidity, movement, luminous though, not dark, not heavy. And so that is the sense of that originating consciousness who bellows. Now remember, the vrishabha, the bull, has been associated with that secondarily. So in the modern translation, the vrish has to be translated by the only word we can access, which comes to the bull, and so we translate as the capital bull bellows. You see, a vrish speaks with vak or roars. It's not the bull. The bull is a representative, a reduction, equivalent, or a symbolic representation. But that roars. That is the creative force, the power, great, powerful, swift, luminous, flowing out, gliding in an intense movement. And you see the third sense of intense pressure, even to injure, to pierce, piercing through darkness to spread its luminosity and to manifest. So when the bull roars, this creative movement of the self is this. And the bull, again, the association which with the bull is masculine, cow is feminine. So it is the self in its aspect of the divine male. Now you'll find in a lot of in the Vedic also, but much more in the Upanishadic, this sense of the divine male, divine as male. And you see some reflection of this idea in many of the more bhakti traditions, in the Sufi, which is also a bhakti tradition. The idea that all the human souls are female in relation to the divine who is the only male. Krishna is the only male. We are all female in relation to him. This derives in the Christian tradition through much distortion, many layers, coming to the idea that every nun who takes a vow of chastity marries the Christ, who is the male, and she is his wife, etc. So all these ideas, you see how they have derived from a deeper principle, which is the divine creative force and power. And yet that's not it. I'm still coming to the third question. I'm linking this to the question from someone who's nicknamed First Last. Why is Gayatri Mantra considered as the mother mantra of the Veda? I'm not sure if it's considered that by all. But still, the idea is here is the deity Gayatri. It's not the mantra. The mantra is the mantra of the deity. So the mantra always is a symbol or a point of access to the deity. The deity Gayatri. If you recognize the root of Gaya, Gayatri, you will find in many of the many of the Indian languages, the Gai comes from this singing or song, Gita. All these variations come from that. They're associated, let's say, families of sounds. So the sense underlying of the Gayatri Devi, the goddess, is this one who articulates, luminously expressing. And so it is the creative power and even associated with the original speech, a vak, of the divine creator, of the bull. The roaring of the bull and the vak of its speech, of its self-expression, is this deity, or sometimes other deity, or the divine mother. According to traditions, the naming is different, but the idea that it is her, that is important. And then if you have a specific mantra addressed to her, that becomes obviously much more important, at least within that tradition. But we should not lose ourselves in the particularities, rather go back to the essentiality which is universal. And then we can see how the particularities differ across traditions without losing the underlying principle behind. So yes, this is now a creative word of the self expressing itself. And how does the self express? The self being infinite, eternal, innumerable, although one always, and always expressing of its delight. Its expression is also then innumerably multiple. All possibilities simultaneously expressed. And so we have a very different approach now to the sense of what this original vak is. And if that is the language of the gods, the creative expression of the divine itself, that language is also infinitely rich, diverse, complex, with all possibilities implicit, inherent. Hold this idea, it's very important. We will come back to one of the very important distinctions of the Sanskrit language and how it shapes your mind as we explore this a little further. So this is broadly what I want to say about in response to the three questions or comments, and now take the view from where we left off last time and build upon this a little further. And I want particularly, to the extent possible, to be able to, that we can all share and appreciate this deep intuitive sense of what we are glimpsing or sensing behind the rationale or even the linguistic values and importance of the Sanskrit language. And to me, this is far more important, the intuitive sense of the experience. So let's just recapitulate. You recall last time and the time before, we saw this very important idea. Sri Aurobindo explains how all sounds have an implicit quality, and they acquire this quality based on the three gradations that they pass through of the etheric, which has contactual vibrations, the air, which is the particular tapas and force, and the fire, which is the particular form. And so behind any sound that you make will be something of these three qualities. And then he says that initially all languages were much more expressive of general sensations and emotional values, not really ideas. And it was the nerves and not the intellect which created speech. Now, having said this in the modern context, because it is a nervous expression, we saw that last time, he gave us this very important statement, and I want to reread this. And I said it is a mind-blowing statement. He said, to use Vedic symbols, Agni and Vayu, not Indra, which is mind, were the original artificers of human language. Agni and Vayu. Why is this important? We'll come to a text of Kapali Shastriya where again we will meet this Agni and we will understand something extremely important there. But Agni and Vayu, Agni is fire as translated. Again, unfortunately, it's not a very good translation, but for our purpose, for the moment, we will hold it. We will look at the root sense of Agni when we will study a text of Sri Aurobindo where he explains that. And you will understand how the sound Agni describes in vibrational quality the force, the power, the divinity, the quality or aspect of the divine that Agni represents, of which the physical fire is a particularization. And you will see in the physical fire the qualities of Agni are replicated. But that's a discussion we will explore a little later. But Agni then consider as this divine will implicit in all creation, pushing forward with heat and luminosity of effort, of aspiration, of intensity. It is Agni organized in us and individualized which becomes the psychic fire within us and the source of our aspirations which leads us forward. Vayu, you can say air would be the crude translation, but in this context it is more appropriately the life energies, prana, which like air is everywhere, flows and is fluid. It animates, gives force, gives life, awakens from the condition of torpor and inertia, or what we would call death, to life. Because ultimately nothing is dead. All is living because all is formed of that, but asleep in inertia or bound in inertia. And so Vayu as if awakes. It is fascinating because Agni, Vayu together then give form. Agni pushing forward, Vayu creating the ripples, animating, and the two together give form. And that form is not yet mind. To that, Indra gives the mental form. So just keep this at the back of the mind as the mechanism, the process within us. So mind has emerged out of vital and sensational activities. Intellect in mind has built itself upon a basis of sense association and sense reaction. But again, when we say Agni and Vayu have built, it's not just a mere figure of speech, it's not a metaphor, it is a reality, it's a real description. So one of the ways you can look at it, which will help, is this power that is Agni as a cosmic principle and this power that is Vayu as a cosmic principle, both aspects of the operations of self, and particularly in matter. It is they who in us give to our sensation and emotion a particular sound. In other words, they build language. When you say, oh, I'm tired, I'm excited, what makes for that sound? Kill, hit, force. The characteristic which comes with the particular distinctions of sound that are associated with these. All these are not formed by you, they are formed by Agni Vayu within you, and therefore any creature or any planet at any point in the universe's existence, the same Vayu, the same Agni, would operate with similar sounds. Therefore the underlying principle of the language of the gods. But waking up from below, by the operation of Agni and Vayu from below, from the subconscious to awaken consciousness. We saw last time how this links later as we grow from the mind to the intuitive, and from above again you plug into the original truth, which is now fully revealed. This is the transition happening today in our evolution. Language built up, we lost derived languages, we lost that connection in the mental phase, and now we are opening to the intuitive phase, and again rediscovering the power of the roots. And so words which were originally vital ejections full of a vague sense potentiality have evolved into fixed symbols of precise intellectual significance. So this is the point we had paused at. One of the implications is a language which is thus formed is not concerned with objects. Think about it. In everything that I'm trying to highlight as distinction, one common feature I'm saying this word is not that object. You see, Vrish is not bull. Agni is not fire. Fire is associated with Agni. Vrish is associated with Vrish. Bull is associated with Vrish, etc. I'm delinking an object and a particularization and coming to a quality bundle by which that object got associated with the sound, or the sound was the natural way of describing that object. So notice one of the characteristics of the Sanskrit language is it is not an object-based language. It does not say this object is that. This is how we've been taught from childhood to learn. You remember the example I gave in early years, I think we must have been 5-6 years old, when this girl asked, what is this, pointing to fish, and the teacher said, ça c'est poisson, this is fish, and the girl said, okay. And something within me laughed at the ridiculousness of it. You just made a sound association with an object, you never knew what the object is. That's not true language. How would you associate language? Well, you would feel the bundle quality and name an object because it has a bundle quality. But the bundle quality is what the word describes. So we come to something extremely important. The Sanskrit language itself is a language of qualities, of guna. Guna is quality in Sanskrit. It is a language of qualities and not objects. So the moment you train yourself to think in Sanskrit, or you grow in that mindset, you look at the world in terms of qualities, not in terms of objects and names of objects. This idea again comes from the biblical tradition and its poor translation in the modern Bible, where Adam is authorized by God to name all the animals. So he says, oh, this animal I will call this, that animal I'll call that. Unfortunately, this is the distortion of translation going through multiple languages and multiple layers across centuries. If you go back to the original sense of Adam, and you find this glimpse in the mystical tradition of the Kabbalah, Adam represents the archetypal man. Actually, it represents what in Sanskrit we call Manu, the mental being, but as the archetype of all mental beings. And as the mental being evolves, you have different Manus presiding over each stage of evolution, etc. Manu was not, as today the leftists will teach you in Indian history, Manu was not some human being who sat down and codified laws. No, even Manu Smriti is not even that. It is an attempt at that point during that stage to articulate what to the mind seemed reasonable and the standard. And that changes with time. So it's not something codified, unlike the Abrahamic traditions where once frozen the word of God is fixed eternally. So even this is discarded. Nobody bothers even in the Indian tradition with the Manusmriti except to take what is relevant if it's helpful. And that's it. You create your own if you need to. But the point is, the Manu, or in this case Adam, represents this mind, a mental man. And there will be a bit of a digression, I'm sorry, but to clarify this. So what happens, for example, in the story in the Bible of Adam eating the fruit of knowledge, forbidden by God. Why would God forbid knowledge? You see, it's a bit weird. So when he takes that knowledge, he wakes up to his own reality of his individuality. He is no more this sub-rational animal type instinctive consciousness. It's a waking up into mental knowledge consciousness, by which there is the loss of the innocence. And so the fall, and so on. But if you look at it in this way, when Adam names the animals, it is the archetype mind looking at objects, describing them in terms of their qualities and naming them. And if you see it in this way, then the naming has a very different meaning. It's like you see this object, what is its implicit underlying distinctive quality, and that you evoke and give to it a vibrational form. That's the true sense of naming, and that would align perfectly with what happens in the Sanskrit language. So remember, the language itself trains you now to think in terms of qualities and not primarily objects. So when you say see two objects with similar qualities, then you name them similarly. Or you find a distinction, then even with the rational mind, you will use the same root sound, derive from it, add one more sound to particularize this distinctiveness, and add a different sound to particularize that distinctness. And you would have a very precise description of two objects which are very different, and yet at the same time the first fragment of the name would match to remind you that they share all these essential qualities. Their distinction is on the second syllable or the third syllable or the fourth syllable, which particularizes this form versus that. You see how there is a genealogy, hierarchy or branches of sounds of the language word formation itself. And in what we read, and we will review something of that, the root sounds in this way are as if holding the power behind the particularizations. You will recall, we have also read from Sri Aurobindo, there is a seed sound, there are primary roots, there are secondary roots, and then there are combinations of these as they are built up. So when we do that, we are constructing in the mind or with the mind as if a chain of qualities to particularize, to point to this. So I've kept a link to one of the talks of Dr. Sampadanand Mishra, which I think you will appreciate. He gave some examples of how for the word water, which is an object, we say, oh, that is water. And he says there are more than 200 words, depending on, of course, how you approach water itself. And some examples he has given: jal, or niram, or vari, or ambu, ambas, apah, etc. There are different terms. Now, if you go to the root of each of these, you'll find the characteristics which are being described. So he, in the example he gives, because there it's meant for a mass audience, jal, he says, is harden. I would describe it as a densifying in form, or giving some density to form. So water is something which can literally take on any form, rigidify as if to give form distinct. So jal, if you go back to the first root, ja is associated with giving birth. So jalam would be through contact or through coagulation, as if giving form. So niram, he says, the root is to lead, to flow ahead. So when you pour water, it flows ahead of you, finding the natural slope to the lowest point, and it leads you as if to that lowest point. Vari is the root, is spreading movement. So you pour water, wherever it falls, the rain falls, it spreads and covers everything. So this spreading characteristic of water, and so on. You could pick each of these words and they describe an aspect, a quality, a distinctive, outstanding feature of the thing we call water. So you see, it is not really describing water. When you say jala, you are describing the quality. When you say ambu, you are describing a quality. When you say niram, you are describing a quality, which we tend by habit to associate with that thing we call in English language water. But you could now use the same qualitative description to an idea or an emotion or to another object which has a similar characteristic. But then you would, to distinguish from this, you would add one more sound to specify what makes this different from that. So you see how in the Sanskrit language automatically words form, or even they flow to fit circumstances. So there are two ways this happens. There is the formation which takes place from the root sounds in the way that I have been describing. You could, for example, take the root kr, which means to do, to act, create, and you build around it variations. So kartru, one who does; karana, the cause, for which causes things. Karya is the work. Kartavya is essential work to be done, etc. All the variations come from the combination of the sounds following. And if you're not sure of what that means, you just quiet your mind. You hear a new word, you're not sure what it means, quiet your mind and drop the last letter. And you'll already get an intuitive sense of what that means. If you're not too sure of that, drop that last letter again and you get a more intuitive sense. You drop the last letter of that, you get a more intuitive sense. And so you come back to something which is essential, from which you flow back through a series of qualities, combinations to that. Now again, if karana, I don't know what that means. I know kara or karya or karma. So already kara, karma, karya, I have already the sense of work, action, doing, creating. And then the na, when I dwell on it, it immediately evokes within my mind all the words which start with na and the underlying quality of that, and that quality now comes as a sub-quality underlying this chain of work, action, expression, doing. And I sense intuitively what karana means. You see how it works, the language. So the beauty of this language is you don't need to learn the dictionary by heart. It is one of the weird features of this derived or coarsened languages today, that when you don't understand a word, somebody tells you, go and look up a dictionary for the meaning. And what happens with a dictionary? You find the word that you didn't know is explained in terms of other words. But you must know those other words. And often the exact nuance of this word does not have any other word. So you are told, oh, it means this. But then why do you have two words if it means exactly the same thing? There's obviously a difference. And that difference, how do you know? You cannot. This is the problem of the English language. You don't know the difference unless you read literature in which that word is used in context and your mind reconstructs within you the sense of this distinctive word. You see the problem? So if you have not read a lot of the literature, you can't appreciate the particular distinctive quality of the word. From a dictionary alone, you will not get enough of it. Just now, maybe an hour back, I was... while my mother asked this question of what is the meaning of this word felicity. So I didn't have my mobile phone to look up a dictionary, and I went into the deeper sense of what it means for me and the way the word is organized within the consciousness, having come across that word maybe a few dozen times in context. And so I said, it is happiness, but it is not a emotional happiness. It is a more mentalized, pure, essential kind of happiness, not an emotional content. So for maybe even a spiritual, sacred sense. That's it. Now when you go to the dictionary, I looked up a dictionary which is Wiktionary, which is a more modern form of the dictionary. Oh, it just said happiness. So happiness, felicity, you have completely different sounds. They mean exactly the same thing. Why do you have a word for felicity? So obviously, because this is the nature of how the language is taught and the nature of the language itself, this word felicity will drop out of the popular usage. Because there is no context for its use. It means happiness, so forget that word. It's only if you go into rich literary texts or spiritual texts, you'll find the word felicity appearing. Oh, Sri Aurobindo or the mother uses this word felicity of the divine presence. Sri mother might say something like that. And then you say, oh, what does that mean? I need to look up the dictionary. Oh, it means happiness. Duh. Why is she saying felicity? It's gone. It's blurred. But if you went back, and so what I did, I have also another thing which is a 1913 dictionary. You see, in 100 years, language today has devolved, coarsened. 1913, it said very clearly something which was a sacred sense of joy and something like that. So sacred happiness, something like that it said. And that was closer to what I was trying to feel from what I felt directly as held within. But this was formed by the context repeatedly met. This is what AI, artificial intelligence, does. So the beauty of the Sanskrit language, because it is so consistent, if you fed all the Sanskrit texts to AI, it would automatically integrate and organize this underlying structure of root sounds and their meanings. The work that Sri Aurobindo did could be used as a starting point to train the AI, and the AI would do the job for the whole of the Vedic text. I am highly recommending for those who might have a little bit of knowledge both of AI and Sanskrit to work on this, because it will be one of the biggest breakthroughs if someone can work on this. But setting that aside now, I'm coming back to this idea. You see, the structure of the language itself is so different that the word reveals its own meaning to you by the fact of the association of the root sounds that you have met. Now, when a first root sound gives the broad context, the second gives a modifier upon it, the third sound will give a further modification, and a fourth might give another specialized modification. So you are actually building a chain which is particularizing more and more distinctively. So now when you see a word going this way, sharing first root, second, third, and then splitting on the fourth, or sharing first, second, splitting on the third. The split on the third and the split on the fourth would give you the sense of greater particularization on the fourth, less particularization on the third, even less particularization on the second. Now I'm coming to something very important, and let this be absorbed intuitively as we explore this. In other words, the longer a word is, the more mentalized and particular its meaning. The shorter it becomes, the more intuitivized, broad and multifaceted its sense. Isn't it? Now, I'm going to elaborate on this a little more shortly. Okay, let's continue. So, when I start speaking, I've gone first sound, second sound, third, fourth. It's got very narrowly individualized, mentalized, let's say, particularized. I pause on the third sound, it is broader. From there it could flow in 10 different directions. I pause on the second sound, from here it could flow into 10 different directions, each of which could flow into 10 different directions. I stop on the first root sound, or secondary root, primary root or secondary root, first sound, which could flow into 10 different directions, each of which could flow into 10, each of which could flow into 10. I'm as if holding in a single first sound 1,000 different variations which are waiting to be expressed, and they're all held implicit in this. And this is, remember, it could be a secondary root or primary root, and from there if I go into the seed sound, it breaks out of the domain of intellect, it goes into purely intuitive, sonorous, vibrational quality. Almost you could see a spiritual force behind, and that's it. Now hold this sense for a while. Take one more step now. I go to the step before, to the zeroth sound. What does it contain? What does it communicate? We come to this extraordinary insight. This is something so beautiful, it is so satisfying, and it is so deep and rich in its implications. You see, we went from fourth, third, second, first sound, and now you go to the zeroth sound. That means the silence before I spoke the word, before I spoke the first sound. In that silence, everything that I could speak ever is implicit. This is the silence of the self. All sound is now the roaring of the bull. But the roaring of the bull is all possibilities simultaneously expressed. Right now I'm not the bull, I'm a particularized, individualized bull. The soul, individual, even mentalized soul, doesn't matter. And in that silence in which all possibilities, infinite potential is pregnant, I make a sound. And with the first sound, the full infinity of possibilities suddenly is reduced to first the seed sound, from there the primary root, and then the secondary root, each time reducing further. And having now expressed the secondary root, from here 1,000 different variations could come. And as I flow into the second sound, that is further reduced into 100 variations. As I flow into the third sound, it is reduced to 10 variations. As I flow into the fourth sound, it has got particularized and points now to this. idea, object, experience, whatever it is. Catch this sense. The implicit underlying paradigm of the Sanskrit language is that all is self-expressing, all is particularization of oneself. Language and the series of sounds is only as if an index by which your mind or your consciousness is pointing to a particularization or pausing at a generalization of various degrees. Now I'm going to state this in more mental terms. When you speak in English, your silence means absence of all communication. It's an emptiness, it's a vacuum. There is nothing there. A silence which is uncomfortable, oppressive, because it's empty, hollow, there is nothing. Please speak, I need some sound, otherwise I feel uncomfortable, I'm scared. And when the sound now comes, it starts expressing and giving you something, filling the emptiness. Into your empty bowl, I am putting drop by drop, arbitrarily, each cluster of sounds sequence is one drop, another drop, another drop, another drop. And in your mind, you are now combining these drops to build a cohesive sequence for a meaning. So in the English language, each word is as if constructing a meaning or adding to a meaning in what is otherwise an empty space. You see, modern physics comes with this same idea, all is empty space. Completely false. The reality, which when you go deep enough into quantum physics, quantum electrodynamics, all is humongous energy of the totality of infinite possibility waiting, and every object is only a particularization of that infinite possibility. This is the underlying truth. When you shift into the Sanskrit paradigm, this is the truth you begin with. All is self, pregnant with infinite potential. The silence of the self is the fullness. It is everything simultaneously here and now. And as I speak the sound, I am as if building an index or like a finger pointing, going to a particular aspect of the self. By pausing at various stages, I am dwelling on more complete or less or more specific, less particular, more complete, or more particular, less, more specific experience or aspect of self. So as in the silence, I begin to flow. It's like a finger flowing down from above through all that cluster of pregnance of force, power, creative expression, and reducing it to this particular and pointing to that. And what I've pointed to has actually, in the act of expressing, built up the experience of what I'm communicating. It's not a pointing to by arbitrary association of sound, it is building the qualitative power of the object that I'm pointing to. In the act of naming, I give to it a force and a reality. If you put this in the context of the mystical dimension of the Adamic story, that God gives Adam the power to name animals. It's literally giving birth, creating those qualities and powers which become, so to say, expressed animals or beings or creatures or experiences. And the power of the Sanskrit, and this is why I've called this the creative power, this topic today, is in the act of formulating, you're actually articulating the force behind that which you're pointing to. The language is a language of expressive power and points to and leads to the experience of that power. Even if you're using it in a most mundane form to point to an object which by association you've learned to associate with. You say Ashwa, okay, horse. Your mind can catch it just like that because you're trained in the very superficial English language. But if behind that is also this chain of the sound qualities, whether you're conscious of it or not, the power of that has already been there. If you are conscious of it and you actually speak the word Ashwa with that quality, then you are consciously amplifying the force behind, and as you say Ashwa, you're releasing the force of that which you describe. This then gives you a glimpse of the nature of the power of mantra, especially when done in this conscious way. Otherwise, even without this conscious thing, it has a power, it has a force because of this. But this is the nature of the language itself. Isn't that amazing? So implicit to the language is the sense that all is self, and the silence of the self is pregnant with infinite potential. And language is only particularizing as you speak to point to an aspect. All the rest are still present, they are not gone. You see how it changes completely. Your attitude to life itself. It is inherently, implicitly a spiritual language, an intuitive language, because it holds the intuitive and spiritual truths implicit in the structure of articulation and language itself. So I said that the words could be formed by combination of root sounds, but once we have come to a mentalized stage of evolution, we can also we can build words by combination of word sounds. So in the link which I have shared, Sampadanand Mishra gives us this example. He is often asked by teachers, what do you say in Sanskrit for some of the modern words? Camera, microphone. So, and he gives the example very simply: Rupa, form, image; Grahaka, which takes. So camera would be Rupa Grahaka, or microphone, Dhvani Grahaka, sound taking, that which absorbs or captures sound. So you could build in this way, but these are all mental constructions. This is in fact the way modern English language is built up. You say automobile, automatic, self-driving, mobile, moving object. So an object that moves by itself. That's all automobile means. By association in time, you have learned to associate it with the word, with this object that we call a car. Of course, it's not self-driven anymore. It was not even before, but instead of horse driving, now you had a machine driving, so it was self-driving to the mind of that period 100 years ago. So it was called automobile. But when you think of it in this way, computer, what is a computer? Something which calculates. When you use today's computers, nobody thinks of calculations. But when computers were first invented, they were used for mathematical calculations. In fact, the term computer actually did not come from machines, it came from people. So if you go back to the 1940s, you would talk to a computer. Did you know that? How? On the telephone. So these people who had to do complex calculations, they would pick up the phone, call up a computer, which was a person on the other end who was specializing in computing and calculating. And they'd say, I need this, please compute this and give me the answer. So they would compute and give it back. That was a computer. A human being was a computer because they were computing, calculating. And when a machine was created which would do that same work and faster, the machine was called computer. That machine became more and more sophisticated until at a time when today the computer is actually an artificial intelligence. It is a graphic screen. It is some place where you create music, play music, you watch movies, you create movies, you do everything literally. And still you call it a computer. The word no more fits, no more describes what it was. So what do? Do you give a new name to it? You can't, because all the literature has already frozen you into this word. If you change the name now, all of your literature becomes obsolete. You're stuck with a fundamental inconsistency and contradiction between sound and meaning. That's the nature of modern languages. If you had to name it from the Sanskrit perspective, and you caught the essential quality, that essential quality would be unchanging because it is essential. It is defined in terms of that, isn't it? Of course, computing is an essential quality, you could argue. And behind all the fancy screens is a computing CPU, computing a processor, which is doing calculations, series of calculations. But that's no more a truth experienced by us in relation to the computer, isn't it? So I'm just giving a few examples of this to highlight not only the difference in the way the language operates, the way it can build, create sounds, words, meanings, experiences, but the force and power that is implicit in the creation and which is also permanent, does not degenerate because it caught an essence. I want to give one more example of this creative process. It's very interesting because remember last time we also identified the sound flowing in the creative movement with the structure of the sound creating mechanism: throat, tongue, mouth, teeth, lips. And I showed or explained how this is something which would be universal. Any creature of any kind, even if instead of lips you had a beak, and the throat could be of various kinds, mouth could be various kinds, lips could be various kinds, whatever you may do in any creature on any planet, structurally it would broadly follow the same, and therefore the Varna Mala, the full spectrum of sounds, would be largely the same. You remember that? So to that I'm going to add one dimension. If the sequence of sounds is conveying the force of what is intended behind, as you articulate that sequence of sounds through the mechanism of speech, the mechanism also follows broadly. You can't make too tight an association, but broadly the sense of the meaning. I'm going to give an example of this. In the Secret of the Veda, Sri Aurobindo speaks of Brahman, Brihaspati, and then there was a word which has fallen out of use, Brahmanaspati. And underlying this Brahman or Brahmanaspati is this idea of the creative flow, moving, expressing, manifesting, from which Brahma in modern times becomes associated with the creator, Vishnu, sustainer, and Shiva as the destroyer. But that's a modern mentalization of something which in the Veda is very different. But Brahma as a deity comes later from this Brahmanaspati, of which the reduced version is Brahman. But what is Brahman? It is the one moving into multiplicity to manifest and to become, and so the creative process. But implicit also is this creative movement of vibration and sound moving into expression. So now you look at how the human speech apparatus expresses the word, even the sound of Brahman. So observe what happens. First you have b, br, br, brah, then brahm, brahman. Okay? Just observe the sequence. Remember the sequence, each adds to something to the meaning. So look at the first sound, b. You cannot make this sound and hold it. It is an explosive sound. Before you can explode into the sound, you have to build up a pressure. And if I have not built up pressure, I can't do the b. Isn't it? So the silence behind the sound already has built up the characteristic of the force of the sound. So before I have spoken Brahman, I have already built up the power which will burst to be. B, burst, be, Brahman. Okay? So force is held, unarticulate. Now watch what happens in the lips. There's an expansion, a pressure built up. And depending on how much power you want to put behind, you build up more or less pressure. B. But wait, the b sound is a pressure built up and then a release. There's no r yet, just b. And a, existent. Remember, a sound is existent. Existent, release into existence. Pressure held, released. And remember what the word used in modern physics is Big Bang. B. Why is it Big Bang? Because it carries that sense of the power of the creative Brahman. That's a Big Bang. They could have said large bang, great bang, first bang, all of which would be correct. The reason why Big Bang has held its own because of the force of the sound. Big Bang. Not huge bang. Not first bang. It has no force of its own. So Big Bang, if you appreciate, because it has a double bang, double b, double expression, you will see why even in the English language all these principles of the Sanskrit language operate, but we've forgotten their power, we've forgotten their force. We don't even know here on the surface, but implicit inside, the principle behind of the Agni and Vayu creative forces are still operating, even in the English language. Which is what makes the Big Bang the natural sound by which to describe an original creative explosion. But notice there also, there is an explosion. That means there was a pressure built up before the explosion came. What, who? Oh no, physics doesn't answer that. They don't even like to go into that. There is no before, because time and space got created with the bang, right? So again, it's not rational. It's not tangible sensorily. It's an abstraction and a play of ideas. And it's not true. The reality is the universe has always been. And it has gone through many cycles of expansion and contraction, etc. But it is eternal. That's a different story. But let's keep for the moment Big Bang. And it came because the originators of this idea were Christians, and they had to fit it into the biblical idea. God created the universe in 7 days, and etc. So they had to somehow give an origin to the universe. And you see, the farther we look back with all the new telescopes, the new Webb telescope, the farther it looks back, it finds complete, mature, complex galaxies existing when the universe was in its infancy of 350 million years old, and you have a rich, complete, gigantic, mature galaxy. You can't explain it. The only explanation is the universe is much older. Then it contradicts with your theory that the universe is expanding. So when you make a mistake, a falsehood eventually will collide with the truth, and there'll always be this internal inconsistencies. So you have to just recognize there was no Big Bang, universe is not expanding. Yes, it's flowing, it's moving, but it's not expanding. That whole thing is an error. But let's not digress too much. We come back to Brahman and the Big Bang. So the first B existing, it exists now. But then there is it's not just B, there is Br. What is the R doing? The vibration is this resonance of vibration which is forming all existence. You could experience it as the underlying delight and the vibration of delight, or you could say it is the original vibrational sound, vak, nada, by which all is formed. And the R conveys that. So Bra. And then Bra. With that you lose all the air, all the pressure built up. It's released, it's complete. So the first we will call this now, I suppose, secondary root now. When you come to Brah, it's already created the universe. But the universe is not yet sufficiently sensorially accessible. So the Ma has to come, and I'm going to associate the Ma sound and the Man sound with the Manas and the mind. So in the first movement, the oneness becomes multiplicity. In the second movement, the multiplicity now fragments, losing its oneness. And that's the mental consciousness which forms that. So Mana, Man, Brahman. Brah as the first movement, and then the Mana as the reflection, decaying, reduction, where oneness is lost in the Man and mental consciousness, which has lost the supramental oneness. Now you see, in the way even the Mana, there is also a Ma. There is no force now, no explosion. It is just a Ma and a Na. It's the Ma repeated inside with the tongue, the same sound. So you could give meanings to it. I don't want to push it too far. You can, of course, and in many of the mystical traditions, they really try to force these things and draw out the maximum juice of philosophy from it. Yes, one can do a lot like that with Sanskrit also, but I will pause here just to give you the sense of how the physical mechanism of sound production actually somehow correlates. And I won't say exactly, but still somehow correlates even with the underlying force of the sound and the power behind and so on. So I come to one very important conclusion or observation from this. Remember what we just said earlier, that in the Sanskrit mind, or the intuitive mind, the self is omnipresent. Your speech, your human vak, is only particularizing the divine creative vak, in which all is already expressed and created. We are now pointing to that, saying, this is what I want to convey, isn't it? So our speech is now this pointing hand of the mind leading to and forming in the process through sequence the quality that this corresponds to, that I'm pointing to. The moment you understand this, you observe something quite extraordinary which now becomes obvious. When you take a dictionary, The Sanskrit English dictionary or English Sanskrit dictionary is something totally different from, let's say, English and Spanish, English and French, English and Italian, Italian and Spanish. In all these, let's say, derived languages, European languages for now, one word has a corresponding another word. It's a one-to-one correspondence. Sometimes this word has a double meaning which in the other language may not match exactly, but those are rare. Broadly, the length of the description of the word of each side is about the same, occasionally one word having 2 or 3 nuances. But apart from that, and those are actually remnants of the root sounds, by the way. Apart from that, one word corresponds to another. So if you translate, all you have to do is replace this word by that, and the rest is only a slight modification of the grammar rules and structures to translate from one language to the other. Very simple. They are mental languages. But when you come to Sanskrit and map it to any of the mental languages, let's take English for the moment. You can't do this because Sanskrit is not mental, its word structure is not the same and with the meaning structure of English. What happens, and this is the amazing thing when you look at the Sanskrit dictionary, first of all, they're huge. The one we have at home is about nearly 1,000 pages. Some of them are much bigger. What you find there is one word in Sanskrit has several words in English. Or you take one word in English and it has several words in Sanskrit. This is so confusing. How is a translator to understand what I am going to replace this word by if there are 3 or 4 different words? Either way. Oh, we say it is context based. Sanskrit is a context based language. Yes, that's true. But that's a secondary truth. Yes, it is a context based language. But that's a phenomenal result of the fact that it is a root based language and that it is a quality based language. Because it is quality based, the quality particularization can depend on context. So, for example, we took the example of water which Sampadanand has shared. So you could say Jalam, or you could say Nira, or you could say Ambhu. Which one am I going to use in the translation? Okay, if you go Sanskrit to English, you'll just put water. But if you go English to Sanskrit, which one? That depends on the context. Which quality do you want to highlight? Now already here in the English language, the word water has lost all sense of qualities. So when you go to Sanskrit, you are required to now highlight a particular quality. But the knowledge of that quality is lost. You have to reconstruct it from the context. If I am using water in the context of life-giving water, then I would use it in a particular way. If I am using water in the sense of rain which has fallen and is spreading, I would use a different word. You see the problem? And AI will have a problem because it will have to understand English. English is a reductionist language. You have lost the deeper, richer information of the context. You have to reconstruct it by reading the lines before and after, or even a whole paragraph or the name of the chapter to get the context to be able to make an accurate translation. The problem, though, in the other way is even worse. You take a context of Sanskrit language, or you take a sentence in Sanskrit, you translate into English, and whether I have spoken, if I am going to say, I appreciated the Jala, but I preferred the Ambu. If you translate it, you will say, I appreciate the water, but I prefer the water. You've lost the meaning. You see, this happens when, even within the English language, when context is very special and words have multiple meanings, then you see this happening. There's the famous joke, I believe there's some truth to it, but it's put in the context of a computer. When the first computer was given the test of translation, they took a biblical phrase, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Meaning, I want to do this, but my body desire or my body inertia is preventing me from. The spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. It's unable to do what the spirit is willing. So the computer translates spirit, alcohol, flesh, meat. And it translated as the wine is good, but the meat is bad. Why? Because you lost the context. If it was in the context of some mind struggle, etc., you would have understood what spirit was referring to. And so, this kind of error can easily happen when you go from Sanskrit to English. This was the great problem of the Vedic translations. And it is a horrible problem because now suddenly you have these sages talking about cows and bulls and horses. What were they doing? They're talking of sunrise and darkness. And then they say weird things like the darkness is nourishing us and the light is nourishing us. There's a dark mother and a bright mother and they're both nourishing. What are they talking about? And so all this gets reduced to historical or natural phenomena. No, they were not naturalists. There are actually articles of Sri Aurobindo where he has to start with that assumption. If he says, oh, this is all bunkam, this is wrong, this is how it is, people just don't accept. So you have to say, yes, they were naturalists, but they use the nature as symbols of a deeper spiritual truth. Ah, okay. So the European mind says, yes, it's a symbol, it's a metaphor. So why were they talking in metaphors? Why not talk about the thing in itself? This is the problem you get when you approach the Vedic study from the westernized mind. You've got into such a degree of reduction that this richness of complexity is troubling, disturbing, demands an expansion. But actually the reality is this, but you have to do a bit of hand-holding to get from here to there until you can experience this. Then you will say, no, they were not using metaphors. What they were describing is the literal experience. But because of the nature of the language, the same experience is also or can be replicated to a degree, but not precisely, not consistently, entirely, to certain phenomena associated with each word equivalent of a particularization in life with external symbols. So yes, there was a symbolism. Up to a point it works, but like I said, after a point it somehow breaks down because certain things don't work. There is, for example, traveling from the lower ocean to the upper ocean. What does it mean? Okay, so by extension you could say space is the upper ocean. Yes, but, and then when they describe the upper ocean, the descriptions are totally different and it doesn't quite fit. So there are problems if you push the analogy and the metaphor further, but the fact is they did not speak metaphorically, they did not use analogies, they did not use similes, they spoke the thing as they saw and experienced with the full force of the experience articulate in the sounds by the root power structure of the language itself. This is the Veda, full stop. This being the Veda, you can also understand it by reduction in a mentalized context where the force of the spiritual principles is reduced now to a mentalized representation, which necessarily happens when we live in a mental consciousness. But then when we live in a sense mind, physical mind, you can further reduce it into a physical representation. Now the problem with that is you could say, yes, it has got reduced. This is a reflection of that which is a reflection of that perhaps. But would it still apply? And we find, yes, it's applicable to a degree. Now the beauty of the Rishi's vision is that they saw the outer forms, mental forms as well as physical forms, as projections of the same vak which forms the language in its origin, forms it in the mental world, forms it in the physical world, the same vak, and there is a continuum. So they were conscious of this correspondence even. And therefore, it can be said, and this is what is affirmed in the Vedic tradition, that the Veda can be understood on three levels. Adhyatmik, the level of the Atman, the oneness of the divine consciousness, where the full force of the words is held. Adhidaivik, in the domain of psychological or divine beings, and the Adhibhautik, in the domain of the five elements. Now, five elements is not merely material. Bhuta is not just material. Five elements also correspond to the subtle worlds. But in the domain of distinctive forms, separative forms, where five elements construct all forms. Forms are not innate things in themselves, which is still true, by the way, in the higher mental regions. The force takes its own form. The thing is form. Here, form is a construction corresponding to the archetype you build from below, gathering material and combining using five elements. So in the domain of the combined constructed form, that is the sense of the Adi Bhautik, domain of Bhuta, five elements, Pancha Mahabhuta. So Yes, it can be understood on all three levels because it is expressive of a truth that operates on all three levels. Nevertheless, it is on that level that the Veda is expressed. Now, once you have understood this, you realize that in order to know the Veda, you had to enter the mind or the experience or the consciousness of the rishis as they uttered the Veda. And the full force of their experience is held in the sound sequence power. And thus, even if you don't know what they meant, even if it is an experience above your range of access, if you repeat the mantra and dwell on the power and the sound sense, in the repetition it would lead you to something of that experience. This is the idea. This is the basis for the more ritualistic form of the development of the Vedic tradition. Since I cannot access that domain of experience, let me utilize the force of that and actualize it here to the extent possible by the force of the word itself. And if the word has a correspondence to objects here, let me arrange those objects in order to gain the material representation of that spiritual truth and recreate it as if in the atmosphere and create as if a vehicle, a vessel in which that spiritual experience, presence, consciousness can be invoked and held. This became the basis for the occult rituals, techniques, knowledge, systems, etc. But the moment you've reduced it to this level, you could say, yes, but you notice any intention I could tie to any sound and thereby build my own constructed belief system, occult system, practice system, etc. What is to distinguish this from that, which is the Vedic? To my consciousness, there is nothing, because that could have been just as arbitrary, because I have lost the link to that vibrational power. But to one who holds the sensitivity of that power, you'll say, no, there is a difference between a constructed and an inherent, implicit, spontaneously true divine reality experience of the sound power and its mantric expression. There is a huge difference. Therefore, in the Indian tradition, you had two very different terms to describe these two domains. One is called Shruti, the other is called Smriti. Shruti is that which is heard. But it's not normal physical hearing. It is the hearing of the higher consciousness, listening to the higher vibrations of the creative power manifesting, expressing through the mantras. And what is heard is then articulated and expressed, transcribed by the rishis in the closest human sound structure possible in the Sanskrit, the Vedic Sanskrit language. But it is still a transcription of the original vibration descending. That's why it is heard, and its origins is not human. They will say, so today there are arguments, people will say, but the rishis composed it, yes, so it is human origin. No, the rishis say, we only transcribed what we heard, which is eternally resonating. It is in that domain of the divine consciousness that the Vedic mantras already and eternally exist. So it's not a belief, it is a reality for that experience. And they have transcribed it to the closest possible in human sound speech. Therefore, its sacredness. As distinct from this is the Smriti. Smriti means remembered. So what you remember which somebody said or did or happened is transmitted as the Smriti. And stories, history, etc. all those would form part of that which are humanly constructed. And that which is heard and revealed in this way as the Shruti is extremely valuable because it is of divine origin. It has a divine revelatory force implicit in the sound itself. And of course in the meaning and in the consequence of the sound and meaning expressed. So you understand why the Veda were considered so valuable and precious. But what is interesting, and we go into something which is quite complex here, if the oneness expresses in this structure, and remember it is expressing from the oneness in which all is present simultaneously. Every rik, that is the verse of the Veda, is a particularization from the oneness, implicitly holding all else behind. There is a natural resonance between certain rigs, certain associations. There are even in their natural resonances, and when we use the word resonance, you see mathematical relations automatically. There are in the natural resonances and relations certain mathematical or geometric relations. Fascinating. So there was a study by Dr. Subhash Kak, professor, where I think the book he titled was this Astronomical Code in the Rig Veda or something like that. And there he showed that in the Vedic verses, the number of verses in specific, let's say, chapters corresponded to the rotational periods of various planets of the solar system. What? How is that? Did the Rishi actually say, hey, by the way, Venus takes so many days, Earth days, to go around the sun, so this particular chapter I will compose with so many verses? No, they did not. Obviously not. And yet when they caught and articulated, in that was natural resonances which correspond to resonant cycles of our planetary relationships. By the way, just because I took the example of Venus and Earth, there's a fascinating resonant relationship of Earth and Venus, as with all planets actually. And this goes into pure mathematical relation and the physics. Venus is in an orbit about half the distance from Earth and Sun. So as it rotates and we are rotating around it, the relation that we have with Venus as we see it in the sky, if you were to take Venus rising from the horizon at a fixed time every day, well, modifying for the days of the year because of the equinox, etc., precession, what you end up is seeing Venus draw exactly a 5-pointed star. So across the year, as it rises, you take a photo at the correct time, and what you see is Venus goes like this, 5-pointed star. Interesting. And so the natural symbol for Venus in the occult tradition is the 5-pointed star, and various other implications. Now, it's not that they saw this and then said, okay, we are going to create this relation. It's that relation is natural to the rhythms, which relation reflects in the natural rhythms of the planets. And by the way, just so you know, suppose we move the Earth closer or the Venus farther by some force, it would interfere. There's a gravitational resonance between Earth, Sun, Venus. And it would interfere in a way that it would pull and push on each other until the orbits would realign to make for this combination again. So all of our orbits of the solar system are fully balanced up to Saturn. Uranus, Neptune and Pluto are unbalanced. In other words, their orbits are still not stabilized by this natural resonance. They are disruptors. They don't belong literally to the harmony of our solar system. Therefore, in the astrology traditionally, we don't even give much importance to them and so on. It's a different story, but I'm just showing you how these are natural truths of resonance and mathematical relations. So when you have something coming like this from above, formed from self and articulated, there would be natural relations among them. And the Rishi need not do it consciously. Subhash Kak gives another example there. I think, if I remember right, I may be wrong by a bit, but the conclusion I remember correctly. He says, if you take the first half of the chapters of the Bhagavad Gita and the second half and count the number of verses and divide one by the other, you get pi. Pi to the so many decimal places. Fascinating. But the last digit is wrong. It should be something else. Then he says there is actually a tradition that says there is one lost verse in the Bhagavad Gita. So if you bring that back and you increment that side by 1, then this digit becomes accurate. I had read this 20 years ago, maybe more, 25 years ago. But you'll find the paper online, I'm sure. The point though is, it's not that the Bhagavad Gita was composed with this idea. It's that when you articulate something which is a spontaneous expression of an underlying divine truth in its purity, it naturally rhythms out and resonates in its natural balance and rhythm, which then makes for these spontaneous mathematical relations. So, this gives you broadly, I think, an idea of the sense of the force of the words, the power of the language, its creative, expressive power. And I will just turn to Kapali Shastriyar's description. In that same text, Sidelights on the Tantra, he describes how in the Tantra, this knowledge of the Vak and the theory of the root sounds and the root mantras, etc., is very highly developed. And they had two methods of accessing it: by mapping it to the chakras within us. Dwelling on the chakra, you could activate and release their power or tune into their underlying spiritual truth. Or the easier way, which was given to those who were not capable of that direct concentration, by the repetition of those sounds, etc., you could concentrate and thus touch those. But then he says, this being the method of the Tantra, you have to distinguish from the method of the Veda. And then he explains the method of the Veda, looking at the same underlying truth. They looked at the deities behind rather than the root sounds and the chakras. And the focusing on the deities, and I will read from a tiny part of this, where he says, the Vedic method of using the Vak for purposes of sadhana, a word is necessary to distinguish from the Tantric method. And then he describes that. I won't go into detail, but just one outstanding fact in the Rishi's manner of approach to the Godhead is that while they were tireless in their effort to commune with the cosmic powers, the gods, and aimed at the higher, they had for their article of faith the one cosmic power of the Godhead nearest to the earth plane. In fact, the presiding king of this world is Agni, the divine flame. So even if you want to reach the higher deities, well, take the one of them which is closest to the earth zone, and the king, the ruler of the material world, is Agni, the divine flame. And Agni has many functions as the heat of the conscious force that effects the formation of things in the world of matter and develops his function in man. For the gods function in the cosmos as natural powers and as psychological and spiritual powers in man. And so he goes on and he describes this fuller manifestation of the divine will as Agni. By activating that deity, you activated the whole progress, also used that to link to the gods and so on. So in the Vedic scheme, the first function of Agni is to voice forth the aspirational call of man for the acceptance by the higher gods of his being in all the parts of his being, so that whatever in man belongs to the cosmic powers will go to their rightful owner, etc. So the first function of Agni is to voice forth this aspiration. So again we are finding this act of the Vak replicated through the human speech. That which was the creative power there of Brahman is replicated here. The bull roaring there now is the human chanting. But what? And for what? But that is the higher function of Agni. When the higher faculties of the human being are as developed as to enable man for the divine effort of self-exceeding and mounting the higher steps of the ladder of cosmic existence. Even before that, Agni's function begins as the voice in man. Agnir Vak Bhutaha. Agni is the formative speech of the elements. We could translate in its completeness. Or it's the speech of becoming. It is this aspect of Agni that the Vedic sages were initially impressed with and used prayer to evoke him, so that he may awake and take up the function of calling the higher powers. Vak, this creative speech, therefore, as hymns, prayers addressed to Agni first and to other gods afterwards, was the main instrument of their spiritual efforts. Vak as prayer was the motor force rather than the concentration and meditation on sacred syllables, as in the cases of yogins of later ages, including the Tantric way. This is the big difference. So, where in the Tantric way, for example, you concentrated on the sacred syllables and meditated on them, here it was a Vak using prayer, the same speech. Now, it's just to show you the distinctions, but also you will see behind this the underlying principles of all use of mantra, all sacred chanting, sacred syllables in all traditions, all religions across the world. They may not have the full knowledge of this whole operation, but they know it, they feel it, and therefore value it. I mentioned, I think, in one of the earliest discussions we had that the Catholic Church insists on the recitation still being done in Latin for a reason. There's an interesting series of books, fictionalized fiction. Harry Potter, you may have heard of it. For a while it was very popular among children. The movies are useless because they just reduce something very rich and nuanced into something very flat, like an excitation of images, which you cannot even appreciate unless you have read the book. But in the book, there are mantras given, evocatory, magical mantras, sounds used for specific magical results. And a few years ago, the Catholic Church came out with a very sharp rebuke, telling its followers not to use the mantras, not to use those sounds of power, because they're in Latin, and some of them are used to evoke demons or to protect from them and so on. And they said those actually work. Don't use it like that. Don't use it casually. Why? Because it's in Latin. That's the idea. In other words, you go back to the root sounds, and there is an implicit power of the root sounds the closer you get to the original. And with that, there is a result, whether you understand the meaning or not, because it creates that vibration. Much more so, as I mentioned last time, in the subtle worlds. You go into the vital world, the mental world, you're out of your body, you speak the same words, and there's a massive shift in reality itself. And you experience there the creative power of the mantra. You come to the physical world, all matter is so rigid. What shifted? You don't see with physical eyes, but there is a shift in vibration of consciousness. And it is for this that the Vedic ritual and the mantra were used, are used, even when people don't understand the meaning. Of course, you could use those mantras for a specific result. I say, oh, these mantras, they invoke such and such deity for such and such outcome. Fine, I will do it for this. So that's how I believe is the structure for the weddings in India. They will take those mantras which correspond to the description of the wedding of perhaps Vishnu and Lakshmi, and you recreate that here. That's one way of doing it. You take and apply it for a specific use. But that's a mentalized application. They're not meant for that primarily, but you can, and it works. But much more so when you are aligned in a higher consciousness, attuned to the self, let us say, to some degree, and you let the vibration of the consciousness of the self now ripple through your mind, ripple through your life force, and vibrate through the mouth, and you speak out the chant, the mantra. It could be a standard mantra from the Veda. It could be your own at that moment expression in the language of the inspired vibration of Deva Bhasha or Sanskrit. And it would have a powerful, profoundly powerful effect. There is an example I remember from a book called Tapasviji, which is of this man who lived 185 years because he did the Kaya Kalpa a few times. And towards the end of his life, he was living almost constantly in the immersion in the self. And there was a time when they were taking him in a kind of a cart. They were traveling, and the wheel of the cart got stuck in mud. And with all the force of all the horses and humans, they could not push it. So they told him, Tapasviji, we are stuck. Can you please do something? So he comes down from his cart, puts his hand on the wheel of the cart. So big wheels in those days. And just says, Brahman, and pushes, and the wheel just flows. It's not the word he used. Of course, the word has a power. It's the fact that he spoke it from the vibration that came from there. And it had the power. Now you could hear that and catch as if the power of that vibration and repeat it in remembrance of this. You've literally tuned in, plugged in, and you express. This was the idea of the transmission of the power of the mantras, which also there in the science of mantra, they say, do not speak the mantra given to you, you will lose the power that was given to you. So even there are people who leech on power and things like that. So it's just to show you that finally it's the power behind. While the physical vibration certainly assists because it's aligned to that and makes possible the full translation of that power in physical vibration and sound and even evoking in the mind, finally it is that which is finding the best vehicle. So you could in principle speak in English and still do that and you would get a result. perhaps in the material vibration it would not be the same result, but in the action of the force it would be the same result. So I think with this I want to close this theme with one last portion, which is a very personal sharing of text from the Lalita Sahasranama, where Panditji used to recite this because of whatever historical reasons, and he did it in his own way. He never followed any formal traditional practices of the rituals associated with the Sri Vidya, but the chant itself, and he did it as an expression of joy, of adoration of the Divine Mother. So in the tradition there are many complex rituals. One of them, interestingly, and I'll leave that in passing, is to associate each part of the body with the deity. So as you chant and as you invoke certain elements of the body of the divine, you map it to your own body by touching specific parts in sequence with those words or with those root sounds, with those bija mantras, etc. There are variations on this, so I'm not going into specific details, but that there is such a concept by which literally your index finger, which is the pointer of your consciousness, you invoke that sound, touch this part, invoke that sound, touch this part, and so on, and in the process identify yourself physically with the deity. And it is this, again, I'm reminding you of Sri Aurobindo describing how he speaks of the body of the language, of which only the spine remains, and the flesh and blood have been lost. So you see, this mapping to the human body is also present in this whole tradition with the sounds mapped to various parts. But all of this is to show that the principle behind these magical or ritualistic forms, I want to hold the attention on the thing behind. Okay, so I want to share something interesting. So in the chant, there were things where you find the names of the deity, of the Divine Mother, Goddess, as she resides in each of the chakras. So there was one particular passage which I always found fascinating, which I will read from the translation. She who is the female element Kundalini in the path, who is the innermost reality of the tradition, etc. And then comes this verse number 38. She who dwells in the Mooladhara chakra, who breaks the knot of Brahma, who helps the devotee to consciously transcend his waking state, who emerges in the Manipura chakra. Here the devotee feels the unreality of the waking state, who then breaks through the knot of Vishnu, and the devotee experiences the unreality of his individual separateness. Then she who abides inside the Ajna chakra at the junction of the eyebrows, and here the devotee uses the sense of individuality, who breaks the knot of Rudra, and so you're freed from your individual consciousness. She who ascends to the Sahasrara chakra, this is the liberation, who reigns the quintessence of the nectar. So this is the translation. Translation is good, but I will do it in a different way. So why am I pointing to this? Because as I would chant this, I would experience the force of the chant, of the mantra, in a particular way, not concentrating on the chakras, but just that explosive force. And I often ask myself, what are these knots which are, because I had enough Sanskrit to understand the meaning. So I'll read now from the text. Maybe I will chant it. You get a feeling of this. So Mooladhara, one who resides in the Mooladhara, Mooladhare Kanilaya, and there she is the breaker of the knot of Brahma. So Brahma, Granthi, knot, Vibhedini, who breaks, the breaker of. So this Bhedini, you'll find the word Bha has this explosive force at breaking with a force. The next, Manipuranta Rudita, ascending into the Manipura chakra. Vishnu Granthi Vibhedini, the knot of Vishnu, Vibhedini. Separative in explosive force, separating in explosive force, breaking apart, fragmenting literally the sense. And then Ajna Chakrantaralastha, as settling in the Ajna chakra. Rudra Granthi Vibhedini, she bursts, explodes the knot of Rudra. Sahasraram Bhuja Rudha, Sahasra and Ambuja Rudha, Arudha, ascending into this Sahasrara. Sudha Sara Bhivarshini, the Sudha is the sweetness, honey, essential honey, who creates the rain of the essential honey of bliss. So there's a movement of a rising and ascending from the Mooladhara, passing through three centers, exploding literally, breaking the knot by explosive force, and then ascending to the Sahasrara, where she releases as a shower of rain the sweetness, the essential essence of the sweetness of the divine consciousness, which then descends. So there's this whole movement of ascending, releasing here, and then the descent of the blissfulness. So when you chant it, it was fascinating because although I understood the meaning and I had no particular concentration on any of these things, I could feel the effect of that, and I would just like to chant it for you in a way that perhaps if you can try to feel the sense of this whole movement of the ascending and the breaking of the chakra, of the knots, and the release of the consciousness and the descent of the bliss. Just two verses. The way Panditji taught. So. मूलाधारैकनिलया ब्रह्मग्रन्थिविभेदिनी मणिपुरान्तरुदिता विष्णुग्रन्थिविभेदिनी आज्ञाचक्रान्तरालस्था रुद्रग्रन्थिविभेदिनी सहस्राराम्बुजारूढा सुधासाराभिवर्षिणी. Then it continues. तटिल्लता समरुचिः षट्चक्रोपरि संस्थिता Mahasakti Kundalini Bisatantu Taniyasi. So she who presides over the 6 chakras and who is called within us as the Kundalini individualized, who is also the Mahashakti, Mahakundalini, etc. So in just 3 verses, it summarizes the whole knowledge of the Kundalini process and awakening. But if you listen to the vibrational quality and this force of the Vibhedini, Arudha rising, bursting, rising, liberating, rising, bursting. This movement of bursting is also not only a breaking of the knot, but the consciousness you experience freed as if transcending 3 times gradations, each gradation transcended to the next. Until here, there is the merging into the divine bliss and the rain of the sweetness of the quintessence of the sweetness. So I'm giving an example of how it would work even with no understanding of the language because of the implicit force of the mantra. If now this you combine with dwelling on the meaning and with devotion and with conscious opening of the consciousness, you can feel it almost like a surgery of the working within you. And so this is a glimpse of the aspect of creative power of the language itself. Always underlying is the self, all is implicit, and as the words form, they flow, developing in steps the qualitative power of the word formed, the thing to which it is pointing, until it settles to point on the thing by literally creating it by combination of qualities. Such is the distinctive and unique character of the Sanskrit language. So I think we are going to take a pause on this. I want you to dwell on this idea. And if possible, all that we have discussed, all that we have described, try to shift your state of consciousness to think in this way, to conceive of the world in this way. And even the power of language, speech, vak, in this way. Not only our human corrupted speech, not just as language, but even as sound, but the underlying sound behind which is heard by the rishis and articulated, which is the creative speech of the divine male, bull we would translate badly, but the divine male who is the creator, the power that expresses, or the divine power, the feminine, the Shakti who flows and forms and gives form to that sound. She embodies, but she is the very substantial vibration of this creative energy of the divine creative speech. And so we can dwell on all this, and our soul, again individualized. Here, perhaps the bull, you could say, the male from whom the power, the Shakti flows, articulating through us as our nature individualized, and so on. So you see there's a very rich background of spiritual knowledge and experience underlying this whole understanding. Let's dwell on this, meditate on this without rationalizing too much. Hold it all in an intuitive sense and let it shift your paradigm of reality.